podcast show, a podcast that helps foster respect through inclusion, service, and equity. This is episode 17, In the Moment with the Boulder Company, how experiential learning elicits connection.
Welcome to the Envision RISE podcast. Today joining us is Ellen and Jenny from the Boulder Company. Thank you both for joining us today. It's always good to have folks that we know and have relationships with joining us on the podcast. So let's start with some introductions. Ellen, you go first.
Good morning. My name is obviously Ellen Feldman Ornato. I'm one of the founding partners of the Boulder Company, and we're a learning and development company based in Connecticut.
I'm Jenny Drescher. It's great to see you all out there, even though we can't. We're imagining you in our minds. My name is Jenny Drescher. I'm the other founding partner at the Boulder Company. And the only thing I would add to what Ellen just said, that we are a learning and development company in Connecticut, is that we're also the most fun learning and development company in Connecticut, for the record.
That's probably true. So I have had the chance to sit in on some of the presentations that you've done at conferences, and it was really an amazing experience to be able to do that. But talk about what the Boulder Company is about. What do you do? How can you help people really achieve some of their big goals and little goals for their business and for themselves?
Oh, I'll take this one on. What the Boulder Company is all about is we're all about not just experiential learning, but experiential learning that gets people to show up differently. So one of the things when we started our company, what was it, 6 years ago, Ellen, I think 7 years ago, we've been in business now. And we started our company. We had both been in learning and development a long time. And we were both really frustrated by the fact that there's a lot of really not just dull training, but training and development work, leadership development work that is based around tell, right? Hello, I'm a talking head and I'm going to tell you exactly how to be and what to do. But no practices, no really meaningful integration that creates muscle memory for people. So when we set out to develop our own programs, we said we want people to actually behave differently and be able to reach for not just the aspirational self, but to bring it to life, because the information age is convincing all of us ourselves included, that if we read it on a LinkedIn meme or a Facebook meme, that must, like if we read it, that must mean that we know how to do it. But that's nonsense. So if you read something like just be yourself, what does that mean in practical application? What does that mean for everyday life? How do you do that? What's the associated action? And so we're on a mission to actually give people the power to show up the way they want to, not just thinking about their aspirational selves, but becoming their aspirational selves. So I'll get off my soapbox now, because clearly I get excited about that.
Ellen, there's now room on the soapbox if you'd like to get on.
Well, it's interesting because Jenny and I come from different backgrounds, but with a lot of aligned passion around creating spaces for, we've done a lot of work in DE&I, and there's always this conversation that people can bring their whole selves to work, right? So that requires individual presence, confidence, whatever, but it also requires an internal culture within organizations where that whole self is truly and authentically appreciated, right? And what we've seen so often in the companies that we're working with is, as Jenny said, they have this aspiration that everybody can bring their whole selves to work, but there is like an underlaying of intolerance within the company for anything but a certain way of behaving, a certain way of looking, a certain way of dressing, certain accents, whatever it is, that is really inhibiting the organization from living that. And so all of our programs are intended to create the culture and awareness that we all need to start with who we are and how we got to who we are, so that we can be more aware of how our belief systems affect the people around us. And that's a big part of our commitment, whether it's in manufacturing, architecture, engineering, construction. We're always looking for how do you elevate the awareness that people can be who they are right? Because we talk about become the bolder version of yourself. And that's very different from somebody who starts off more introverted than somebody who starts off more extroverted. It takes a different, maybe turning of the knobs of how we behave in relationship with other people to actually be able to be that brave self. So
let's talk a little bit about what experiential learning actually looks like in this context, because when we think about it, when we think about learning, and my background's in higher ed, we often stop thinking about how learning takes place once formal education is done. And we kind of think, all right, well, I've graduated from high school, or I got my GED, or I've got my master's degree or whatever, I'm done now.
mm-hmm.
How is learning different with adults? And what does experiential learning allow people to undertake in that practice?
Mm-hmm. So I'll start, you jump in, Jenny. First of all, before we came together as a company, we were working frequently as external trainers for other companies and delivering content that they had developed. Clearly with adult learning in mind, but without an understanding of adult attention span, the need to break state and move people around, the need to take them out of their heads and into their bodies, the need to take them out of their heads and give them a writing prompt. And so the best trainings that we were delivering for other people were the ones where actually we were able to infuse some of that, because they said, go ahead and add your personality to it, which gave us the permission to say, okay, everybody stand up, right? Because so much of the training that we were being asked to deliver was very frontal. It felt like, college again. There's a PowerPoint presentation where people's brains go to sleep, right? And occasionally there'd be a breakout, but there was nothing that got them into their bodies. It was all very focused on how does this apply directly to what you do in the conversation? So they didn't really have a chance to practice the skill, right? So what we noticed about adults, and particularly on Zoom, is they have about a 5 to 7 minute attention span for any one conversation before we have to put them into a different way of learning.
You're making me think about something, Ellen, which is that another big piece around adult learning that is often missed is adults already know a lot of stuff. So adults, so if you think about it, go inside and listen to your own thoughts for a minute, right? Stacy, you do that. People listening, go ahead, listen to your own thoughts. What's that inner chatter saying? What am I doing next? Grocery list. Where are the kids? What's that noise? Why is the dog barking? Like, there's a constant inner chatter, right? It's an inner narrative. And I call this my headator. Or some people, you could call it the judge in your head. You could call it consciousness. You can call it whatever you want. I actually name mine depending on my mood and depending on the tone of that voice in my head. I recommend that highly for anybody. Like, if I'm nervous, it's Nervous Nelly, and she sounds like this, right? But learning to recognize the role of that voice in learning can make or break really effective adult learning. Because what happens? We go into a room with other adults, and suddenly there's ego in the mix. Suddenly there's internal chatter in the mix. And that internal chatter can lead us to think all kinds of thoughts. It can lead us to things that, like, I know that already. I don't need to practice that idea, right? Again, the drop in is, what do we think we know already, which is distinct from what are we actually practicing? What are we doing? What's the action, as opposed to, oh no, it's only from here up. Has nothing to do with how we behave. So I know that already is something that we acknowledge up front in a room. And we wish that other facilitators and teachers would do this, to acknowledge for adults, you know a lot of stuff. You're experts in your field. You are competent. You're a leader, because then you set them up to be back into beginner's mind, back into, oh, just because I know a thing doesn't mean I have all the answers. And it also doesn't mean that I'm always showing up with integrity, right? We see this in DEI. Stacy, we've had this conversation with you all the time about RISE, which is that, again, that distinction between here's who we want to be, but there's a big behavior gap. And some of acknowledging that and helping people move through that, no matter what the subject matter, is to stop and say, what's the inner voice in your head saying? What's your inner expert saying to you right now about this topic.
Mhm.
And it's not a matter of knowing that that expert is saying something. It's a matter of engaging in practices that release that expert into the wild so that you can stay focused. Right? We do this improvisation in theater all the time. It's part of why we pull improvisation in for our learners. Is if I'm on stage in a theatrical context and I'm improvising, I have to suspend the judge in my head if I want to be in the scene. The exact same thing applies in learning. Exact same thing.
And to yes and that, so the flip side of I know all this already is I don't know this already. I don't want to look bad in front of other people. So one of the things that we notice is a lot of companies are saying that they want people in their organization to be more assertive, and they want them to be more deliberate and confident in the way they communicate. And we meet person after person who is clearly stuck behind their face, not speaking because they don't want to look bad or they're not sure they're correct. And so when Jenny mentioned, we use improvisational exercises. So roll this back to the genesis of our company. We started taking improv classes together because we've been friends for 15 years. And we started taking improv classes, theatrical improv classes, for fun. And noticed that as we were taking those improvisational exercises, we as individuals were getting better at listening and being in the moment and being spontaneous and being focused on what the other person was saying instead of in our heads. And, Jenny did some digging and found that there's this thing called the Applied Improvisation Network, which is an international association of people who take the exercises from improvisation, as well as the practices, the principles, and all the fundamental beliefs of it, and bring that into learning environments, right? For us, we use it mostly in DEI and in communication and leadership development, right? But what improvisational exercises unlock is play and joy and laughter, and everybody screws up, which is really important because it's a great equalizer when nobody is good at a thing, and then they get better together, right? It builds that connective tissue between people where status doesn't matter, right? The least skilled person in the room can be the best person at catching a red ball when it's thrown at them, imaginary, right? And keeping all the different pieces and parts in play. And it also has us learn to show up more vulnerably. Is that a word? Vulnerably? Yes.
It is now.
It is now.
We have more vulnerability because
out there, it's
right,
now.
you can't be in the game if you're afraid of being wrong. And, and I will say we get a lot of conversations in engineering we really need our engineers to speak up in these meetings, and they're very reticent to speak up. So having them play at speaking up when the only question I have to say is, what's your first word association when I say the word bat? And then we notice them sit there. It's like, no. You're in your head. What's the first thing when I say bat? This ball. Okay, great. Next, right? They didn't die. We always like to say to them, see, you didn't die. It's all good, right? To build their awareness of how much they crawl into their heads on things that don't mean a thing, and to build their confidence that they can just say the thing without dying.
So one of the things I want to talk about this concept of experts and getting people comfortable with being an expert, but not in everything. And how does that show up? So one of the things that we talk about in DE&I world is that we are all experts in our own experience. And that's really the thing where we can be most confident that we are sure that we know.
Mm-hmm.
The part that I think people find frustrating when we're talking our own experience is the disbelief that comes on the other side of that conversation. When you're sharing your lived experience and the other person responds with, no, not really, and questioning your own expertise and your lived experience. So I can imagine that with improv, that exercise can undo some of that reaction of, no, that didn't really happen. No, that the answer of, no, I don't believe you is not something that is part of an improv exercise. Is that correct?
So it's a very interesting. So what I'm hearing is that you're looking at the questions of when somebody else is not necessarily being supportive to another person in a conversation.
Yes.
That's part of it.
Yes.
Another part of it is somebody overcoming their own discomfort in what someone else is sharing with them. Because if I'm denying what you're telling me, then that's a clear indicator that your story is bringing up something uncomfortable for me, right? So those are two pieces right there that I will address. One is this idea of being a supportive conversation partner. So improvisation allows for a next level of support in how you interact with other humans. So in theatrical improv, which is distinct from improvisational approaches to communication and learning, either one part of what we teach, what we use is a notion called make your partners look great, which means that no matter what comes out of your mouth, I'm deciding that you're right and what you say is true and actual. So when we're working with a group and we're cultivating trust between the members of the group, one of the first things that they learn is my job is to be a great support partner. My job is to put you first in the conversation, not my own self, not my own ego, not my own desire or need to be right or to be seen. Believe it or not, it's actually easier in a conversation for me to put my attention on you in an improv comedy scene, theatrical context, then if I'm in my head and I'm thinking about what's my next move, I'm not giving my full attention to you as my scene partner. But if I do that and I put that on if I put all of my attention on my scene partner, it becomes way, 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 way easier. So if you teach that same idea and you put it into an everyday conversation, then you set people up to make each other right. That's a support move in a conversation.
Yeah. So the way that might look is something like, Jenny, I was walking down the hallway today, and I walked past a group of men standing in the hall, and I was really uncomfortable because I felt like all eyes were on me as I walked by.
So you had a really uncomfortable moment today when you walked through a group of men and all the eyes were on you. It sounds like something you want to have a conversation with someone about.
I do. I want to sanity check it and see if maybe I'm overreacting. I don't know. I don't know what's going on there, but I definitely had sort of that Scooby sense of this is not cool.
Yep. So there's some emotion going on for you. It sounds like that might be taking you out of your workday today.
Definitely. I've been in my head about it all morning.
Okay.
I'm
busy right now, but I really want to help you in this conversation. So can we meet around 12:30 and talk it out? If we need to, we can, leave the building, go for a walk, something like that.
Thank you. I really appreciate your listening.
Yeah. So what did I do just then? So I didn't make her right or wrong. All I did was hold space to validate what she was saying. I fed it back to her, which is another key component that we borrow from improvisation, is an extra high level of listening, right? We have to be listening at a cellular level if we really want to hear what's going on for people. And so I made her right. I validated her perspective. I didn't question it. And I listened well. So I did the essence of making your partner look great without necessarily following the road of, for lack of a better way of putting it, I didn't necessarily buy into her story, so to speak. I stayed neutral about it. I stayed charge neutral about it. All I did was hold space for, here's what I'm hearing you say. Here's what I think you need.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about the listening piece of this, because as I'm sure you know, and I know most of our listeners have heard this, that the vast majority of humans would say, I'm a very good listener. And what studies have found is that only about 10% of us are very good listeners. So how do you train yourself? How do you get people to get in that space of becoming truly a good active listener, as opposed to someone who is hearing what's being said and believing for themselves that they're being a good listener when really they aren't?
So we have, believe it or not, we have a full day, maybe even more, of listening curriculum, because it is we believe as an organization that there are 4 key pillars for strong organizations. The first one is listening. The second is speaking up. The third is cultivating strong relationships. And the fourth is cultivating ownership, right? But without listening, none of those other things happen. So what we do is we have people engage in exercises where they start to get a self-awareness around how often they interrupt, either themselves or other people, right? How accurately they listen to what's being shared with them in terms of their ability to share back what they heard, right? So but we're not saying, talk to your partner about a challenge you're having with a coworker. It's talk to your partner about your favorite sandwich, right? Or share, pull up a picture in your mind of the most recent picture you've taken on your cell phone. Share with your partner a story about the people who are in that cell phone picture, and then have somebody interrupting them constantly as they're trying to share that, which has them realize how often that happens. It has them realize how often it takes them offline in terms of their focus and attention. And it also, in a debrief conversation, because we're not just doing exercise after exercise, we're doing an exercise, having people play their way into self-awareness, and then having a debrief conversation of drawing a bridge between what you just experienced and then noticing how many times a day you take yourself out of being present, either because you interrupt yourself or you interrupt others. And then people say, oh my God, you must have been a fly on the wall in that recent meeting that we had, because nobody was listening and everybody was interrupting.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you because all I can think about right now is tuna on rye, because you asked, what is your favorite sandwich? And I just went down the rabbit hole of, I love roast beef on toast. I really dig grilled cheese too. And I dig tuna on rye. So there's a perfect example of, in the moment, none of us are ever fully masters of listening. That I had to pull myself back into that conversation because I went down a quick rabbit hole for about 10 seconds while Ellen was giving this beautiful explanation of, this is how we do what we do, is put people through live practices, give them that aha moment of saying, oh, wow, the way I just did that exercise is the way I'm also showing up in meetings. It's the way I'm showing up in my primary spousal relationship, whatever it may be. So that's just hilarious that showed up for me. Just like, it takes nothing to take us right out.
And that it happened for me too. As soon as Ellen put the idea out there of, this is an example we would ask people to use in a classroom setting, my mind went to, oh my gosh, what if she asks me about my favorite sandwich? I don't really have a favorite sandwich. And my brain was, what if she asks me? I'm preparing for an answer, as opposed to just allowing myself to listen to the content of what is being shared, because we're also, even people who are used to being wrong, being put on the spot, at least that's my experience a lot of, being wrong, making mistakes in public and being put on the spot. Our brains are still trying to protect us from what we feel is looking foolish in front of people. And this is in front of 2 people I know pretty well.
Yep.
And not even thinking about listeners who, and here I am thinking, what's my favorite sandwich? I don't have one. God, please don't ask me, Ellen.
Yeah, right. So it's, another layer of this is that I love that you're bringing up for me, Stacey, is this idea that not only are we never fully masters of it, but one of the keys to the kingdom around how do we become a great active listener is to recognize that we're always terrible at it. That's a note that we got directly from our very good friend, Kat Coppett, who is also in this work. I perform with her at the Mop and Bucket Company. It's connected in New York. Quick plug for our improvised comedy there when we do that on the side. And, one of Kat's notes that I've always loved is straight out of the gate, just recognize that it's one of the most impossible things for humans to do. And that it is one of a group of skills that we can never truly master. We can only ever pursue mastery of it.
Mm-hmm.
And those are very different things. So I guess, it's kind of funny. This whole question came up around being an expert, overcoming your own internal expertise. I'm such a fan of saying I have expertise in something, but I always sort of veer away when it comes to I am an expert at, because they come from very different places.
Mm-hmm.
One says I am pursuing excellence and mastery until the day I drop dead. The other one is I've already got all the answers and I'm not really so open to beginner's mind.
Mm-hmm.
To me, the magic is always in having beginner's mind in any possible part of life.
So the other thing that came to mind for me that is directly related to RISE and diversity work is this notion of we're always already listening. So I have this conversation with Stacy. I have an idea in my mind of who Stacy is. And so my relationship with you and the way I listen to you comes through that filter of our relationship with each other, right? So for people we don't know well, based on how they look, we may have stories. I'm not going to say may. We all have stories of who they're likely to be based on who they are and how we perceive them, right? So when we talk about being excellent at listening, it's also that the DEI behind conversation of what is my emotional response to the person who's directly in front of me, and why is there a charge? And is it charge neutral, charge positive, or charge away from? I'm going to say towards and away from, not positive and negative. Mm-hmm. Because for people that we're really comfortable with, who look like us, sound like us, who we perceive to be us, we lean in. For people who we don't know, but we're swimming in the same pool, like we're at a conference and we're all together, right? We may be charge neutral for we're walking down the street or we're in a new social setting, and we may be leaning back heavily into the story of who these folks are likely to be based on very limited information. So that's part of listening too. Our head editor has a lot to say about how closely we listen to people based on who we perceive them to be. Right.
So Ellen, you're tempting me mightily, because I think it would be fun. And I guess listeners won't be able to get as much of an experience about this, but we'll make the noise so that they can. Ellen, let's do a quick round of whoosh. We don't have to do the whole thing, but let's just do the whoosh, because I think it's a great example of how this can be brought to life in a real life situation. So Stacy, I want you to do exactly what I do. I'm going to do it to Ellen, and then she's going to pass it. It's very, very simple for people listening to the podcast. I'll just quick describe it once we've all had a chance to do it, but you'll hear the sound I'm going to make, which is whoosh,
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 whoosh, whoosh,
whoosh.
Excellent. And the way that this would apply in a class, for example, is that we would have a whole group of people doing this. And what has often come up for people in that exercise is this thing that Ellen is tuning into, which is that's how we're operating when we're operating from assumptions about people. So those stories that Ellen is referring to that we already have in our minds about you're like me, you're not like me. We have something in common, we don't have something in common. We're in that, we like to think of the whoosh zone as that means I'm being in a default mode, as opposed to a mindful or intentional mode, which may involve me challenging my own assumptions, checking my own stories at the door, or even in the moment, and pausing to listen more acutely and carefully to the person that is my conversation partner. So I think one thing that is exciting about the work that we're continuing to uncover in the diversity and inclusion and unconscious bias space is that we are adding that physicality that lightens the conversation, and people need that.
So I've got one last topic I want us to cover before the end of the episode here. And I think I've shared with you both I've got a 7th grader and she attends an art school where she's a theater major. So obviously improv is a big part of her day, theatrical improv. And the thing that she tells me about when they're really focusing on theatrical improv is that it's fun, and that it's fun because you don't have to study for it. You can't study for it. There's very little you can actually do to get ready with your scene partner, especially if they're taking prompts from the rest of the class.
Mm-hmm.
And she loves those days at school when it's fun. Mm-hmm. So how do we get fun back into what we're doing every day when you're working in manufacturing, you're working in engineering, and while those may not necessarily be the first careers that come to mind when you think about a fun environment, although I think probably a lot of engineers would disagree with me that it is fun. How do we bring fun into our daily lives? Because it's missing for a lot of us.
I'll take that one.
So, sorry, I was just thinking, be willing to be cheeky. But go ahead, Ellen.
I'm going to say there's a business case for fun. Right, for all of your listeners, when we are having fun, when we're laughing, when we're engaging with other people, our brains churn out positive chemicals that inform our physicality, that give us access to creativity and language and innovation and connection that we cannot have in sort of that hyper vigilant, I'm afraid somebody's going to yell at me space, or I'm afraid I'm going to do something wrong space, because we can't, our brains are primitive and we do a lot with brain science, and we talk with the people in our workshops and our series about brain science, because if they can understand that when they're afraid, it's harder to find access to language and learn, then it's like, well, what can you do to calm yourself down? Right. So we might throw in a 2-minute meditation, like a breathing exercise in the middle of a workshop. And people are like, well, what's that? It's another way to change state and to have people notice how quickly they can click back into calm, because we can take them to happy from calm. It's really hard to take them from scared to calm and then energized. Right. So laughter, joy, presence, connection, build businesses. When people like and trust each other, and they don't have to be best friends, but when they can laugh together and they can feel like they're not the butt of the joke. So that, once again, that goes to sort of that DEI space of, when I trust you to support me and to be a good scene partner, then anything can happen between us. I will bring my not fully formed idea to you and we can noodle it around. If I don't trust you, I'm only going to give you what I perceive to be a good idea, which means that all of the things that could be good ideas with more group mind associated with it will not come to the surface. Right? So that employee engagement thing happens when people feel like they're in an environment where they can bring their best selves, which is generally involving humor and connection, because that's how we're all wired. Right? What do we do on our calls with you and D? We laugh a lot.
I just was thinking about the fact that, laughter lubricates. That's the bottom line. Laughter lubricates. And so there's the trust piece of it that you're talking about. And it also makes me think about, we can be doing very serious work and be light with one another.
Yes.
That is so possible. And that's often an element that takes people by surprise when we're working with them. I mean, for example, doctors that we've worked with in hospitals, they do really serious work. It's a serious thing to be an ER doc. Like, that's not something you take lightly. But if you can find levity within and figure out how to hold a lot of other things lightly, still in the space of, I must attend to this patient right now, right here, it changes the way people operate when they start to learn how to hold things lightly, because instead of walking around holding everything from a heavy place, they start to release in more places. And I think that that's particularly important in the DEI space, is we can, in any topic, we can get bogged down, right? And then we're carrying it heavily. right? We're carrying it heavily in our mind. We're carrying it heavily in our conversations. We're carrying it heavily through conflict, through any number of workplace situations. But if we can learn to hold a lot of things lightly, then we shed more, we lighten the things that must be held in a sacred space and in a heavy space, right? So I think that that's part of where building the practices and the muscle memory that come from emotional intelligence work and unconscious bias work that is taught through an improvisational approach, it just opens up access in a way that, I don't know, we need more of it in the world. Of course, I would say that, but you know.
We both would, yeah.
I might be biased. That might be my conscious bias going on there.
Well, and I'm hearing it in a lot of places. I was listening to a podcast last night, and there were three gentlemen talking about what does humor actually do? Does it tell the truth? Does it obscure the truth? How are we using it as a tool? How are we using it as a shield? So I think a lot of people are really giving some serious thought to how fun and laughter can be a weapon or a tool. And we need to be really mindful of how we're using that particular skill, because I do think there's skill involved in humor, to build our relationships rather than tear them down. Which brings me to the last question. Talk about Boulder Jam.
The Be Boulder Jam. The Be Boulder Jam was an experiment that we had wanted to run for a while. We thought we really want to run something that's going to be a regular opportunity for people to show up and just work on themselves and have fun and be connected. And then COVID gave us that opportunity because we were so busy running around that we never really started the jam. And then when we all got trapped in our homes in March of 2020, I guess it was, we said, all right, let's actually do this jam that we've been talking about for a long time. And the whole idea of the jam is that it gives people a free, fun, connective, quick half an hour to show up and run experiments on who they're trying to become. Run experiments on becoming the boldest version of themselves. So like Ellen said, if I'm quiet, maybe that means what I can show up and gain from the jam is a little bit more assertiveness or a little bit more volume or a little bit more willingness to get a little bigger and try a little more outward stretching. If I'm, a shrinking violet like me or Ellen or you, Stacy. Wait,
yes.
Did I say that out loud? If I'm maybe a little big, then dialing it down could feel like a really bold move, right? So for a person who is big, holding back can feel scary. So the Be Bolder Jam is a couple of times a month. We have the schedule on our website, and it's a half an hour. We do different things. We might do a meditation or a writing prompt. We might play an improvisation game. We might do something from emotional intelligence body of work. We might do something from positive psychology, which we're also big fans of. So there's all different kinds of tools. We usually do one experiential approach, and then the rest of it is free-form conversation and discovery and people building their skills, building their mindset and their approaches to who am I out to become in the world. So,
and I will say, I'm sorry. And I will say about the jam that one of the things that we learned there was that people over time, like it became a non-negotiable on their calendars, particularly in the midst of COVID when everybody felt very shut in their houses. People were coming from all different industries into the room to laugh together, to share, to not think about work or all of the other things they had going on. And one of the things that we saw was sort of an opening of the way they behaved with the group. And so it became part of our repertoire of when we're putting together a long-term engagement with a client to say, we're going to do this session where they're learning about emotional intelligence, and then they're going to have a couple of jams in between where all they do is practice the skills of emotional intelligence, laughing with each other and trying stuff on. And then we'll go back to content learning. right? Because you can only shove so much in somebody's brain. And this virtual space, unfortunately, has given lots of people permission to be on video all day long. And folks are really burned out by that, right? So if we can get them to have just short bursts and say, work on this till next week, come back and tell us how you did it or didn't do it and how it felt, right? And over time, they build trust with each other if we're working with an intact team, because the jams are just a play space. There's no agenda except the one that we set, right? So it creates an opening for them to get to know each other better and differently.
All right. Well, we're definitely going to have you both back to cover some more of these topics, because I could literally talk with you about this all day long. But Ellen, Jenny from the Boulder Company, thank you so much for joining us today. What a great way for us to start our 2022. And we'll have you back soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.